And we're going to be continuing this evening in the book Devil Worship, The Shocking Facts. And we're going to be picking up here on page 279. Now, this particular area that we are in right now, the particular part of this book that we're in has to do with birthdays, the celebration of birthdays, idolatry and abomination. And you know, this is something that is celebrated by almost every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth, except for those who understand where these customs come from. And one of the things that was covered last week is that the celebration of these birthdays ties in with the ancestral custom, the worship of the family genius. Okay, and the genius was simply like God that watched over the family, and it was a God that appeared at the birth of the being whose function it was to protect. It formed, now what it did is it formed, the belief was that it formed the infant's personality. The power of the child's genius depended upon luck. If it was a boy, it was called a genius. If it was a girl, it was called a Juno. And this is what is actually celebrated. It's actually worshiping these guardian spirits, these ancestral spirits, and that's what that is what the birthday, the celebration, the customs of the birthday celebrations do. Trying to see here. Let me see. And then one of the things we covered last week is that these things involved sacrifice. And many times, you know, people think, you know, sacrifice has to do with, you know, the slaying of an animal and blood and all of this and throwing things on the altar. You know, while it does have to do that, you know, a sacrifice it can simply implies, and Pastor showed here on the bottom of 277, you know, he shows that this source reference, and this was from a history of private life, it shows here that this word sacrifice always implies a feast, and that the Apostle Shaul said in no uncertain terms that the things to which the Gentiles sacrifice, you know, the Gentiles, the unbelievers, they sacrifice, you know, that they sacrifice to demons and not to Yahweh, and that's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 20. So, you know, you can see how this celebration of these birthdays and these other things, you know, they do exactly fall into that, because what goes on with the birthdays in the world? Well, they have big old parties. They have they have these feasts. They have cakes and ice cream and all of these things, and candles. And the candles, when the candles are blown out, the smoke, you know, represents the taking of the prayers, you know, up to the gods, to the ancestral spirits, you know, and so. That's what's actually behind these things. Now, sacrifice is not always killing an animal and then eating it. A sacrifice also implies that of merely offering to the gods. You know, it doesn't have to be anything, you know, to offer thanks for their food in the name of a god. You know, that's all that is necessary. If somebody thanks God for the food, that is a sacrifice. That meal has now been sacrificed to the gods. It has been offered up. Now, let me see here. The birthday of a member of the family, an excuse for festivity. So notice there, the birthday, that almost like they used it as an excuse to do something, to get together and to party. But it says the birthday of the member of the family, an excuse for festivity, had greater religious significance in Rome than it is apt to have in the modern world. And it shows here, it says, in the house a turf altar was erected, gaily decorated with flowers, and on it offerings of food and wine were made to the genius in the case of a male, or the Juno in the case of a female. Candles were lit and incense was burnt, and that was until in 392 A.D. Theodos forbade such pagan practices, and everybody wore white. You know, they trying to make it look all pure and holy. There was a birthday party, a dinner to which the guests, relatives, and friends were invited and brought presents, or if they could not come, they sent them. And this is the same practice that continues today. Now, those who are still celebrating their birthdays with these rituals are still sacrificing to demons, even though they don't realize who they're sacrificing to or what is behind it. it doesn't change the fact that that is what's going on, that the mere act of doing these things is sacrificing to these gods or to these demons. In Deuteronomy 32, 16 through 20, it shows here that they provoked Yahweh to jealousy with their gods, and they provoked him to anger with this abomination. They sacrificed to demons, which are not of Yahweh, to gods they did not know, and to gods newly come up. So, they sacrificed. That was these things. They sacrificed to these gods. They made these offerings. Psalm 106:37, on the top of page 279, shows, and they sacrificed their sons and daughters to these demons. Ignorantly or not, Pastor says, and it doesn't matter if it's done knowingly or ignorantly. If it's being done, it's being done. Ignorantly or not, when one celebrates a child's birthday, they are sacrificing by prayer or by the action of celebrating itself that son or daughter to pagan gods. The Apostle Shaul went on to say in 1 Corinthians 10, 20 to 22, or 21 to 22, shows very clearly that you cannot drink of the cup of Yahweh and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of Yahweh's table and the table of demons. You notice, and it's interesting that the Apostle Shaul put it that way because of what these sacrifices, what they entailed. It was a meal. It had to do with the table. Do we provoke Yahweh to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? So when one goes through any modern equivalent of this ancient pagan ritual of a birthday celebration, whether it is lighting candles or any other rituals previously mentioned, the child who is being honored, or not necessarily the child, but even the adult who is being honored, is being sacrificed to this demon god to use as this god sees fit. You are actually asking this demon god, through this ancient yet modern custom, that this demon god teach your child. They're being presented to actually teach them. To teach them through this ancient yet modern custom, that this demon god teach your child to be against Yahweh, just as the gods are against Yahweh. Is it any wonder, Pastor writes here, is it any wonder that this world hates the name of Yahweh? You think about it. When somebody says, oh, you want to come over for a birthday celebration? You going to celebrate your child's birthday? No. Why aren't you going to do that? It's a celebration for the child. There's no harm going to come to it. Give that baby some cake. Give him the presents. Give him these things. What harm can come from that? Well, you see with the practices that are behind it, the harm is that it will separate you from Yahweh. And that's exactly what it has done with the world. It has separated them from Yahweh. So is it any wonder that this world hates the name of Yahweh? Is it any wonder they also hated Yahshua? How about the disciples? How about the prophets? Who taught against these things? Now, what about anyone who follows the laws of Yahweh, who tries to keep any form of holiness? This hatred follows. But in Yochanan 15:25, it says, but this is to fulfill what is written in their law, that they hated me without a cause. Why would anybody hate being taught the way to salvation, the true way to salvation? Well, it's not that they hate that, it's they don't like being exposed as a liar. They don't know how to react to, people just don't know how to react to the realization and just the simple fact that they've been lied to all their lives. And a lot of times, that is responded with hatred. And Luke 21:17, and you will be hated above all men for my name's sake. Yochanan 15:18, if this world hates you, know that it hated me before it hated you. This hatred is going to be there. Yahshua said it was going to be. The apostles said it would be. The prophets said it would be. In 2 Timothy 3:12, and yes, all those who will live righteously as Yahshua Messiah will suffer persecution. The persecution, if you live righteously, you will suffer. We are going to suffer that persecution. Is it any wonder that one's own blood relatives turn against him or her when he or she is called out of this world by Yahweh? It's one thing to have a stranger, but your very own flesh and blood, your own father, mother, your wife, your wife, your children. grandparents, the people that you thought you were close to, when you come out from among them and stay and stand for the laws of Yahweh, and then that hatred comes, that is a major test. That is a major test. But it's one that we have to overcome. It's one that we have to deal with. Because we have to prove to Yahweh that we're going to want his way above all else. Now, and Yeshua said in Matthew 10:34-36, he said, "Don't think I've come to send peace on the earth. I didn't come to send peace between you and your wife, or you and your children, or your parents, or your grandparents, your aunts, uncles, whoever you hold near and dear, or whoever you held near and dear, your brothers, sisters out in the world. I didn't come to send peace, but I came to send a sword. For I've come to set man against his father, and against daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own house." And I think every man, every man sitting here who's come out of this world has experienced this to some point, at one point or another. Some probably more severely than others. But yes, Pastor says, all those who hate the laws of Yahweh have been sacrificed to demons. They have all been taught to hate Yahweh, and even though they don't even know him. And in hating Yahweh, they also hate those who follow him. They turn their anger, they will turn their anger against those who they can see. And of course, the closest representation of that is going to be those who stand for righteousness. But they hate us without a cause. Now, the prophets of Yahweh are against demon worship here. It says it seems as though almost everyone has the mistaken idea that the Apostle Shaul or the Apostle Paul rose on the historical scene just to do away with all the laws of Yahweh. That's the whole idea. Well, the Apostle Paul did away with the laws of Yahweh. No, he didn't do away with the laws of Yahweh. He taught every word that proceeded out of the mouth of Yahweh. Which, Pastor shows here, if a man will practice these laws, he will live just as the Scriptures themselves say. Now, the Apostle Shaul studied at the feet of Gamaliel, who was a great Hebrew sage, as you can read for yourself in Acts 22:3. And because Shaul was privileged to study under one of the leading Hebrew teachers of the law in his day, he was also privileged to be taught the prophecies of Yahweh. So he learned both the laws and the prophets. Shaul read Yahweh's prophets of old, just as he also read from the Torah, and this is also where Shaul received his understanding from Yahweh to denounce this demon worship for what it actually is. Shaul was not ignorant of God worship of the nations, just as he said in 1 Corinthians 10:20. He did not want us to have fellowship with demons. There's no fence sitting in the house of Yahweh. You can't sit on the fence. There's no way that you can do it. You can't have one foot in the kingdom of Yahweh and one foot in the world. It just won't work. If you've got one foot in the world, guess what? You are a servant of the world. That's why we're told to come out from among them and be separate. Not to hop on the fence and straddle the line and wait to see which way it's going to go. But we're told to come out from among them and be separate, says Yahweh, and do not touch the unclean thing. And that includes these unclean practices. Now, no matter how innocent any custom might seem, I've got this start here because I love the way Pastor put it here. He says, no matter how innocent any custom might seem, disguising a lion to look like a lamb will not protect anyone who touches the lion when he's hungry. It doesn't matter what you call it. You can call a lion a lamb, you're still going to get bit. But reading from the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, we find this information about demons. It says demons is a generic term in the Septuagint, and the term demons is used to render the Hebrew words, and you can see the Hebrew word there, in Deuteronomy 32:17 and Psalm 106:37, which denote objects of pagan worship. And it shows here that some of these It says, though it became post-biblical Hebrew a common term for a malign spirit, it is simply, and this other word here that you can see, a protective demon, which usually represented a winged bull or colossus. Now, demons are objects. These demons are objects of pagan worship, which includes a protective demon. And as we have previously proven, the protective demon in pagan Rome were known as a genius for a male and a Juno for a female. However, this reference from the Interpreter's Dictionary also states that the demons may be represented as a winged bull or colossus. The winged bull, as we have also previously proven from the two Babylons, the symbolism of wings, now this shows here that the symbolism of wings is deity, or a god, a deity. And the symbolism for a bull is a prince or ruler, a king. Therefore, the pictures of a winged bull one sees from time to time in various source references as a symbol of a king who is a god. And let me see here if I can see if this is going to cooperate with me here. Not very well. Not very well today. Let me see. There we go. See if we can get it. I'm going to see if I can pull the brightness up here because you can't. I can go back and do this right. Technology is wonderful when it works, I tell you. All right, we'll just do it this way. Okay, so the winged colossus here. You can kind of see that representation there of what that winged colossus is. It has the this winged bull. You can see here the of course the wings on it, and you can see kind of like the face of a man here on the front, and that is that symbol of that king who is a god. And this, you see a lot of this in Egypt. You see him in Babylon as well. But the winged colossus, the symbolism for wings is deity, as it shows there. And colossus simply means like a gigantic statue or any hugely important person or thing. So that's one view of one of those. That's kind of a side view, so you can kind of see the wings on him a little bit. And this here is actually kind of like a three-quarter view. See, there it goes. Okay, so again, you see the face, kind of like the crown. You can kind of see the crown. You can see the legs. Okay, so then from Unger's Bible Dictionary, it shows here we find a colossus in the palace of Sargon. From Sargon is known as a winged genius. Now, this winged genius symbolize the fact that this genius is a protective demon. So that's one picture. Oh, I don't know if you can see that. That's kind of the wrong thing. That's not actually the winged genius we're talking about. That is more what we're talking about. That is the winged. That is that winged. A picture of that winged genius. That is the protective demon. Okay, so that would be the genius. That would be the protective demon. That's a relief or a carving of what that demon, of what that winged genius is. This one here is a representation. Now, this is actually on a piece of pottery, but that is a representation there of the female, of the Juno, of the winged Juno. That would be the protective, what they viewed as the protective god or goddess over the female. Now, this protective demon was a god, and it shows here these demons are nothing more than pagan gods. And we see here from the Interpreter's Dictionary, the Bible shows that the pagan deities as demons, they're simply pagan deities. A particular interesting example of this usage occurs in 1 Corinthians 10:20, where the faithful are admonished that they who partake of the Lord's table cannot also partake of the table of demons. The word here means pagan deities rather than devils, is shown clearly by the fact that the expression is simply an extension in a general sense of the prophet Isaiah's more specific allusion to the apostate who forsook the Lord and set a table for Gad, and the RSV version, fortune, the Canaanite god of fortune. The word Gad may be added and is actually rendered by that Greek word there by the Septuagint. Now, as you've read for yourself, the word Gad, as used in Isaiah 65:11, is actually rendered demons in the Septuagint. So what is Isaiah 65:11? This warning here. In Isaiah 65:11, there is a warning against eating and drinking to the things sacrificed to the genii, the demons of good luck and fate. But because of the way the scripture is translated in the King James Version, you would never understand this scriptural fact. Then in verse, you can see here Isaiah 65:11 in the King James there, you can see it. It says, I hate reading out of the King James. But ye are they that forsake the Lord, that forget my holy mountain, that prepare a table for that troop, and that furnish the drink offering unto that number. Okay? A lot of double talk, and that was actually designed that way to, I think, to kind of confuse people. But yes, eating or drinking to these gods is done simply by asking that God or Lord bless your food before or after a meal. It can be that simple. That table could be loaded with everything, with all sorts of clean food, and then somebody goes and offers it to Lord or offers it to God. That whole thing has been sacrificed to demons. And we've got to be careful. And this is why Pastor, he admonishes us constantly to be wary around our kinfolks. Be wary with them. Be on guard with them, especially around these pagan holiday times, because these tables, they can and are and will be a snare if we are not careful. And we're beginning to see now how easily that can be, how easily that can take place. It says, if you do not yet understand that the Creator himself has never identified himself as a God in any of the original writings, please write for our free booklet, Who is Lord God and Who is Baal? Okay, we've got them right back over there in the corner. But if you are invited to dine with anyone and they ask God's blessing on the meal, then the meal then becomes a sacrifice to demons. And eating of the things sacrificed to demons is strictly condemned in the Scriptures. Okay? Be the same way if you're working in an office and they have somebody brings in they're celebrating a birthday and they bring all this food in to celebrate this individual's birthday, and they have a plate of vegetables or they have a plate of something over there that would be clean. You go over, just not thinking about it. If you go over and you grab a piece of celery, or you grab something on there and eat on it, you've just partaken of the table of demons, because that meal was sacrificed to these demon gods, to these genii. But in Revelation 2:14-20, we read, But I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold to the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to gods, and to commit fornication. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you permit that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat the things sacrificed to gods. We're going to see an instance here. I don't know if we're going to get to it this evening, but there was an instance in Daniel, in Daniel chapter 3, where there were three men. There's three servants of Yahweh. They were trying to be forced. King Nebuchadnezzar was trying to force them to bow down to this God, to participate in this God worship. And we'll get to that, Yahweh willing. We'll get to it this evening. If not, you'll be getting to it next week. But the word-for-word translation of Isaiah 65:11, you can see that down here, and down here at the bottom of the page, and you can read how the Hebrew flows from right to left, and you can see the Hebrew words there, and how they were translated for the destiny and for the fortune, and those were translated as troop and number in the King James Version. Now, on page 284 at the top, we see here that the word translated troop in Isaiah 65:11 was translated fortune in this interlinear by Kohlenberger. And the word troop is number 1408 in Strong's, and which shows troop to be Gad, a Babylonian god called fortune. And there you see word 1408, Gad, a variation of 1409, fortune, a Babylonian deity, okay? And then the word number, you can see is translated destiny, which also shows that to be the god many, M-E-N-I, and God also called fate. All right, so in Isaiah 65:11, we are warned about these Babylonian gods, and we're warned against the practices of God worship in their honor. To prepare a table for a troop or god or Gad or fortune is to eat in honor of this god. To furnish the drink offering for the number of many, fate, is to drink in honor of this god. To eat in honor of a god, one only needs to ask God to bless the meal that you are about to eat. This is a feast. This is also a sacrifice to demons and not to Yahweh. Okay, this is a feast to the gods. Do not get this confused with the feast of Yahweh, the feast that Yahweh sanctifies and sets apart to make holy. But these are feasts to these gods. But not only this, the fact is that these Babylonian gods were genii, the same gods that the pagan Romans honored at their sacrifices, the same gods this whole deceived modern world honors today on their birthdays. And we will see this fact plainly in the following pages of this article. So, Pastor, you look at how much detail that he's going into here to show the depth, just how far this God worship goes. And it's so subtle. It's so subtle. We really have to be on guard. Just like the prophet, just like the apostle said. We have to be on guard. For Satan walks about like a ravening lion. Seeking whom she's going to devour. I mean, that's, the deception is there. And we've been warned that the tables, the table can be a snare to us. So now we're beginning to see a little bit more. We're getting a little bit more understanding of why that is the case. But troop and Gad, genius of good luck. It says from the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible on volume 2, page 335, we find that Gad is a god or genius of good luck. The same god that the Septuagint version has called a demon. So that's why we never tell anybody good luck. Okay, because that's calling upon a god. That is a god. That is a demon. The deity or genius of good luck, worshipped by Jewish apostates, probably in the post-exilic period, together with destiny. The nature of the deity is clear. Where he is identified with fortune. So you can see here how the source here is just showing that God and Gad is identified with this good luck, is identified with fortune. Number of many, the genius of good luck. And you can see this here from the Interpreter's Bible Dictionary, where it shows that this is deity of or genius of good luck. Under the word destiny, in the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, we find that the many destiny, fate are the names of a pagan god. It says, therefore, Pastor shows here, therefore, because these gods, these genii were worshipped and served through these God worshippers sacrificing to these gods and then eating and drinking in their honor, Yahweh himself was forsaken. He was deserted and the holy service to Yahweh. The obedience to him and his every word was forgotten. So, they forgot Yahweh because they followed after these gods. They took on these pagan practices. And they were told and they were warned not to worship Yahweh in the way the heathen worship their God. Be careful, they said, that you don't be careful, that you don't be ensnared into following after them, saying, how do these nations worship their gods? I will do the same. The warning was there, not to follow, not to do these things. But this was done through deception. Now notice how this took place. This was done through deception, accomplished over a long span of time. So, with this accomplished, or this was accomplished by substituting Yahweh's name in the Hebrew Scriptures with pagan titles. These titles obtained from Canaanite god worship. Okay? It says, and when the people only heard the pagan titles, the titles of pagan gods being spoken, even though Yahweh's name was clearly written in these same scriptures, slowly Yahweh's name was forgotten. And not everybody, and this is what we kind of need to think about too. The scriptures were not available to everybody at that time, because the scriptures all had to be hand copied. Right? There was no such thing as a printing press. There was no such thing as mass production. There was a scribe, there was a copyist that had to copy word for word, every page of the scriptures. And so it was a very, very rare commodity that the people actually had this. And so what they had is they had the teaching of the priest who should have kept knowledge. But these priests, what did they do? They consumed and they ate swine's flesh, and they replaced the name of Yahweh because in their minds they felt that the name of Yahweh was too holy to pronounce because there were a bunch of curses that were coming down upon them. But the curse, and they felt and they thought, or they reasoned in their minds that the reason the reason the curses were coming upon them was because they were using the name of Yahweh, not realizing or not understanding that the reason that the curses were coming upon them was because of their sins, because of the things that they were practicing. And so they began substituting the name of Yahweh with the titles of Lord and God. And the people didn't have the scriptures to actually look at. And so what did they do? The names were slowly repeated over and over and over. And over that time period, it became accepted. So the name, this was accomplished by substituting Yahweh's name in the Hebrew Scriptures with pagan titles obtained from the Canaanite god worship. And when the people only heard the title of pagan name being spoken, even though Yahweh's name was clearly written in these same scriptures, slowly Yahweh's name was forgotten. And because this deception took place, the people today actually think that they are worshiping the Creator when they call upon the names of lords and gods and pagan religious, ritualistic practices. And Pastor shows that this is called idolatry. Okay, on page 286. Idolatry, the worship of pagan gods or worship with pagan rituals. Reading from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, on page 515, we find this information about birthdays. And there's a whole booklet. I mean, this is a whole chapter in this book on birthdays, and we have yet another booklet back over there that talks about birthdays in detail. But it says birthday. This term occurs in Genesis 40:20, the birthday of Pharaoh, and in Matthew 14:16 and Mark 6:21, the birthday of Herod Antipas. There is evidence for birthday celebrations in Greece and Persia. And we see that these celebrations of individuals with a special meal and of the king, the pre-Hellenistic Greeks celebrated the birthdays of the gods and prominent men. And it shows here that that during which these festivals, during the festivals when the birthdays of these gods were celebrated, the Jews were actually forced, or the believers were actually forced to partake of the sacrifices. And again, we'll see that a little bit later when we get into Daniel chapter 3. But directing your attention to the phrase in this source reference, which says the Jews were forced to partake of the sacrifices, I want you to be fully aware of the fact that the ritual of sacrificing was in the celebration of the birthday of gods and prominent men, and this source also tells us. Also remember that a sacrifice does not always require the slaughter of an animal to take place. The sacrifice, or a sacrifice, is anything, food or drink, things or people, which have been prayed over while using the names or titles of the deity, the god, or the demon involved. Sacrifices do include the killing of animals, as this article clearly proves, But the sacrifice does not always include this. And that's in the minds of the people. You think about in the minds of the people today, ask them what is a sacrifice. How would you, what would you do if you were going to sacrifice something? What would you do? Well, I'd go out and kill an animal, or I'd go out and do this, or I'd go out and do that. They don't make that connection. They don't realize, and they don't have the understanding that they can sacrifice something simply in prayer. It's just simply something that's offered to the gods. And Pastor shows here, he says, please keep this fact in mind, that it was the sacrifice to the gods in which these Jews were forced to partake. The rituals of sacrifice are of primitive simplicity. The owner of the animal ordinarily slaughters its own victim. The blood is poured out on the ground, smeared upon a sacred stone, upon tent ropes or doorposts, and the flesh then makes a feast for the owner, his family, tribesmen, or guests. Reading again from the history of private life, from pagan Rome to, I can't even pronounce that one, Byzantinism. A sacrifice also always implies a feast. But not only this, we read that a sacrifice was a much more important occasion than merely an invitation to dinner. And it shows here in this reference here, it says the principal rite of every cult was of course, the rite of sacrifice, which the people attended in a contemplative mood. It was important to bear in mind, however, that in Greek or Latin text, the word sacrifice always implies a feast. Every sacrifice was followed by a dinner in which the immolated victim was cooked on the altar and then eaten. The flesh of the victim went to the participants in the ritual, the smoke to the gods. On feast days, the people invited their friends to sacrifices in their homes. Such invitations were considered a greater honor than a mere dinner invitation. Think about that. The flesh of the victim went to the participants in the ritual, and the smoke to the gods. Now think of a birthday cake. What do they have on a birthday cake? They have candles up there, right? And the participant, the person in honor of this, they blow out the candles, the smoke rises to the gods, and then the cake goes to the participants. Okay, you can kind of see that correlation there. Okay, the vapors of incense it shows here, spewed forth from many houses on these great occasions, and among the important holidays were the national feasts of the emperors, the festivals of certain gods, New Year's Day, and the first day of each month. A custom cherished by Romans wealthy enough to practice it was that of sacrificing a piglet on the first of the month in honor of the household gods, the Lars or the Penates. Once a year, the birthday of the Pater families was celebrated with genuine fervor. On that day, the family feasted in honor of its protective deity or genius. And notice notice we see a lot of times, and many times, what's associated with these sacrifices is unclean animals, specifically a pig. It's just interesting to see that. I mean, you see that with Christmas, you see it with, with Thanksgiving, and then you see it here as well. But sacrifices were a more important occasion than just dinner invitations, because the sacrifices were held in honor of the gods which were worshipped. When the Jews were forced to partake in these sacrifices, they were being forced at this time to participate in the birthday of the king, a ritual of pagan god worship, and this was done in just an innocent birthday celebration. But they were being forced to do it. The people were being forced. And many times they were forced, if you don't do this, you're either going to go ahead and participate in this, you're going to do this, or you're going to die. In the Anchor Bible, it shows here that these particular rituals of a birthday celebration, it says, on the monthly birthday of the king, the Jews were cruelly compelled to partake of the pagan meat of sacrifices. When this festival of Dionysus was celebrated, they were forced to put on wreaths of ivy and march in the procession in honor of the god. A decree was published in the neighboring Greek cities on the proposal of the citizens of Ptolemais that proceed against the Jews in the same manner, and compelled them to partake in the meat of pagan sacrifices, and that they butchered those Jews who refused to go over to the Greek way of life. So, It was no different, no different than the Crusades were. You either recant your religion and come over to this way of life, or you're going to die. This is another form of that. The same practice, the same things were done during the Inquisitions as well. But this was God worship. This was the birthday ritual. I mean, you can see the evil that was behind it. There's nothing righteous behind it. There's nothing beneficial behind it. Behind birthday celebrations, it's evil, as we can see that here in this particular instance here, as it's described. But we'll also see in a couple of the examples in the scriptures that talk about birthdays as well. About the evil that took place and the killing that went on in honor of these gods as well. But it shows here, it says this was God worship. This was the birthday ritual, and we see this here in continuing reading from page 276 of the same reference. It says the Greeks did celebrate their birthdays monthly. And it says the Hellenistic monarchies on the monthly birthdays of the kings. The birthday of Antiochus IV was on the 25th. So the birthdays weren't held once a year, it shows here, but they were held monthly. It says when we read about the birthday of the king in 2 Maccabees, the king mentioned is Antiochus Epiphanes. And this actually, Epiphanes means just a manifest God is what it means. It means an appearance. But Pastor, he continues here on the bottom middle of page 288. He says, please notice these facts. This abomination was taking place over 150 years before Yahshua Messiah was born. And these abominations were being exerted by a king of Syria who considered himself to be a god. And this was taking place as we've just read, during the Hellenistic age. And I had to look that up to see when that was. But the Hellenistic age ranged, it was a time period in Greek history of the time of the rule of Alexander the Great. And it was about from 323 BC to the emergence of Rome, to the emergence of the Roman Empire, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 31 BC. And it actually continued, this practice continued right on into the Roman Empire, as we're going to see here in just a little bit. But these abominations were being exerted by a king of Syria who considered himself to be a god. The worship of kings had precedence both Oriental and Greek because of the narrow dividing line between gods and heroes. Okay, there was a very fine line there between gods and heroes, and the general pagan feeling that a great benefactor was in some sense divine. Such worship was fairly common in the Hellenistic age and was later more widespread in the East than in the West. The worship of kings, however, was imposed in the Roman Empire, but was known as emperor worship. And we see here in the Encyclopedia Judaica, it talks about emperor worship, where it says here that the Roman cult established during the reign of Augustus, first in the provinces but not in Italy, and it was practiced throughout the Roman Empire. It is a direct continuation of the Hellenistic worship of the ruler, and the worship of the god, the worship of the emperor as a god, and we see that continued right on through the popes. The popes are considered to be infallible, right? Because they are considered to be God. This emperor worship, which was practiced throughout the Roman Empire from Caesar Augustus on, was a direct continuation of the Hellenistic Greek worship of the ruler as a divine being on his birthday. The worship of each emperor's personal genie, which was instituted in the Roman Empire on each emperor's birthday. The Roman, and this under genius here, and the Encyclopedia of Mythology here, the underlined part here shows that the Roman emperors subsequently instituted the public cult of their own personal genie for the entire duration of their term of office. So they basically set themselves up. They set themselves up as gods and set themselves up to be worshipped as gods. Now, life and leisure in ancient Rome relate some of the pagan jollification in which the Jews and early believers could not share. And that pagan jollification simply means like merrymaking or lively celebrations. The empire brought a spate of new celebrations, official and unofficial, achievements of Caesar and of Augustus, new temple dedications, and imperial birthdays added. With the imperial consecrations, 32 new festival days on the calendar between 45 BC and AD 37. The process continued under each successive emperor. So you had all of these holidays. You take a look at that time period from 45 BC to 37 AD. They had 32 new festivals added between that time. And with each new emperor, as each new emperor came into power, that process continued. Among these new celebrations, many of them short-lived, the birthday and anniversary of the Ascension Day of the ruling emperor must always have been memorable occasions to the whole empire over days of great embarrassment to the Jews and, says, to the Christians here, who could not share in such pagan jollification. But it was no secret, to the pagan mind that the celebration of birthdays was nothing but their own pagan god worship. They knew what it was. And they knew this to be the fact because this was their intention, to worship their genius or Juno on their birthdays. However, the fact is that one of the best kept secrets in the world today, the world today doesn't know the origin of it. They don't know where these things came from. But why? It's because this world's preachers do not tell you that the celebration of birthdays are a religious ritual which came from pagan god worship. However, for you to celebrate a child's birthday, you actually separate you from Yahweh because you have become an idolater. And, that's actually shown here in Unger's Bible Dictionary under birthday. It says the custom of observing birthday was very ancient and widely extended. In Persia, they were celebrated with peculiar honor and banquets, and in Egypt, the king's birthday was observed with great pomp. No reference is made in the scripture of the celebration of birthdays by the Jews themselves. So notice, the believers, the worshipers of Yahweh, they didn't celebrate birthdays. There's no mention of it in the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation that any of the believers, any of the saints of Yahweh ever celebrated birthdays. The latter Jews regarded the celebration of birthdays as a part of idolatrous worship. And as you may read for yourself, Pastor shows here, he says, no references get made in any scriptural celebration of birthdays by the Jews or by the believers because they considered the celebrations to be idolatry. And in the Encyclopedia Judaica, it shows here under idolatry, it talks about the biblical injunction against idolatry. And it shows this injunction against idolatry comprises three more or less separate matters: the worship of idols, the worship of God with pagan rites, and the making of idols. It says the biblical injunction against idol worship includes idol worship conforming to pagan rituals. So not following these pagan rites. Exodus 25, Deuteronomy 12:30. It talks about, and Exodus 34:14, it talks about offering sacrifices to another god, but it talks about, to idols here. Exodus 22:19, which according to the rabbis includes the performance of any of the rituals that form part of the cult prescribed for the service of the Lord here. It says the Bible conceives idolatry not merely as the worshiping of images, but as the worshiping of anything real or imaginary other than, it says God here, but other than Yahweh himself. So idolatry, that's what it is. Idolatry is worshiping. And remember, worshiping is service. And it doesn't matter if it's real. It doesn't matter if it's imaginary. But worshiping or serving anything or anyone other than Yahweh himself. And it says here at the very end here, it says that Yahweh should be worshipped according to his will. Yahweh leaves no, he leaves no question about how we are to serve him, how we are to worship him. He tells us where we're to go 3 times a year to learn how to reverence Yahweh. He's very clear. He doesn't leave it up to us to decipher in our own minds, well, what are we going to do? We have to figure it out for ourselves. No, Yahweh has provided a teacher for us to point us in this direction. Yahweh has brought us to his house that he's reestablished in the last days to once again bring salvation to the earth and to show the world how to reverence Yahweh, how to serve and worship the Creator. And this is what is being taught week after week, by our pastor. In Deuteronomy 12, 31 to 32, we find this fact clearly written. Now, you can't argue with this. It says, "You must not worship Yahweh your Father in their way, for every abomination to Yahweh which he hates they have done to their gods. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. Whatever I command you, be careful to observe and do it. You shall not add to it, nor take away from it." And remember all that has to be done. It's very, very. It would be a very simple thing, for us to fall back into that, to offer something to a God. It can be done simply by asking the God to bless it. But it says, as Deuteronomy 12, 31 to 32 has told us, "Do not worship Yahweh in the way, because everyone else worships their gods. This is an abomination to Yahweh, and yes, emphatically, birthday celebrations came only from the way of pagan worship. They are a thing desirable to mankind at first glance." It's desirable. But remember, Satan made sin to appear desirable to Eve. That's the hook. That's the pull. It looks desirable. It appears desirable. But what's behind it? Ultimately, again, as we've seen, it separates us from Yahweh. Sin will separate us from Yahweh. But they are an evil religious pagan practice that Yahweh's people should repent of ever having been involved in. Since idolatry, here from the Encyclopedia Judaica, it says, since idolatry is specifically forbidden, its practice constitutes a violation of the covenant that is made with Yahweh. Remember, Yahweh promises, he says, if you will diligently obey my voice by keeping my covenant, by following my laws, statutes, commandments, and judgments, I will be your father and you will be my people. That kind of in a nutshell is the covenant. If we're obedient to Yahweh and take on his character by following his laws, then Yahweh promises us that he will be our father and we will be his children. But following idolatry or falling into that practice is a violation of that covenant. And Romans 6:16 tells us very clearly that we belong to whom we obey, right? In Deuteronomy 31, 16 and 20, and Yahweh said to Moshe, "Behold, you are going to rest with your fathers, and these people will soon prostitute themselves to the gods of the land that they are entering, and they will forsake me and break the covenant which I made with them. For when I have brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, the land which I vowed on oath to give to their forefathers, and they have eaten to the full and grown fat, then they will turn to the gods and worship them, breaking my covenant and provoking me." Jeremiah 11:10 says, "And they have turned back to the iniquities of their forefathers, who refused to listen to my words, and they've gone after hinder gods to serve them." The house of Israel and the house of Yahweh alike have broken my covenant, which I made with their fathers. And Pastor shows here, he says, digressing, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that not all images are to be considered idols. And he shows here, he says, the biblical prohibition of making idols does not include all images, but those images that were considered to be gods. And he says there is a distinction between an image and an idol will become clear in the light of the pagan belief that an image was not to be worshipped unless it was properly consecrated to a god and transformed through the prescribed cult into an idol. So there was actually, a process that was done to consecrate these images and turn them into idols. And it shows here, it says the living idols on pagan religions, and it shows here an idol in the pagan mind. It says, Eliah's ridicule of Baal in 1 Kings 18:27, and Isaiah's mocking of idols in Isaiah 44:9 through 21, were the argument offered by the psalmist that they have eyes but they do not see, should be taken literally. It attempts to disprove the belief that the idols were in possession of sensory faculties. The biblical description of idolatry as sacrifices to the dead and the idols of wood and stone and similar descriptions challenge the pagan claim that the images they worship were in fact living idols. Let me see here if I've got it here. Yeah, we should have time here. And it says, the making of an idol, the identification of the god with the idol was effected by a special ceremony of consecration known as the washing or the cleansing of the mouth. Egyptian and Babylonian records dating from the biblical period give minute details concerning the rite of consecration by which the image is transformed into an idol, into a living idol. By virtue of this ritual, the gods also identified with the reliefs that were in the walls of the temples. The pictures of the idols were able to eat and drink sacrifices and libations that were offered during the services. The ceremony by which an image is consecrated and thereby made into a god is recorded in Daniel chapter 3, verses 2 through 3. But this washing of this ritual was known as the washing or the opening of the mouth. It was known by a couple of things: the washing of the mouth or the opening of the mouth. Okay? And basically what it says, the Babylonians believed that the wooden, gold-covered creation did not actually possess any divine attributes until this ceremony was performed. It was just a simple piece of wood or stone or whatever. Once the ancient Mesopotamian inscription records records the vital words of this ritual, the statue cannot smell incense, drink water, or eat food without the opening of the mouth. The ancient Egyptians believed that the ritual existed, which would bring sensory life back to the decedent's form, enabling it to see, smell, breathe, hear, eat, and thus partake in the offering of the foods and the drinks brought to the tomb each day. Once the deceased was rejuvenated back with all of his senses, and this was this whole ceremony that was done, he could also interact and watch over his family members, affecting their lives. And it says, letters have been found to attest to the continued contact, or at least the belief in the continued contact between the deceased and the living. It says the ritual would reanimate the deceased was called the opening of the mouth or the washing of the mouth ceremony. It was an important ritual in both funerary and temple practice. It was a big thing. I mean, I can remember reading about it in the practices of the burying of the pharaohs in Egypt. But the opening of the mouth ceremony originated as a ritual to endow statues with the capacity to support the living Ka, and the living Ka was simply the Egyptian equivalent to the immortal soul. So basically what they're saying is they would perform this ceremony and the statue or this thing would now become alive. You know, it would become able it would be able to eat, drink, and would be able to interact with the living. And that was the thought processes that kind of went behind it. Now, just finishing up here, just real quick, there was a ceremony of this by this, which this image was consecrated in Daniel chapter 3, verses 2 and 3. And if you remember Daniel 3, remember when King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold? And it was 60 cubits high, and this is in Daniel 3:1. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar, the king, summoned together the princes, the governors, all the officials in the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the princes and all of the officials in the provinces assembled together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before the great image that he had set up. And there were three men. Anybody remember what the names of the three men were? Okay, that was the name that King Nebuchadnezzar gave him. What were their Hebrew names? Anybody remember? Hananiah, Mishael, and praise Yahweh, and Azariah. Praise Yahweh. And remember, those three men stood up when they were being compelled. And we read in here about how these people would be compelled, about how the believers would be compelled to do this. And the King Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them and said, "Is it true And he said, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? It says, now if you are prepared to fall down and worship the image which I have set up at the time you hear all this music, remember the merrymaking and everything that went with this. Okay, you see what we read in here out of the historical records, what we read there out of these authoritative sources, it's backing up exactly here, and this is a perfect example of it in the scriptures. He says, now if you are prepared to fall down and worship this image, when you hear all this joyous music, then it will be well with you. In other words, it's going to be okay. Just go ahead and do this, and everything will be just fine. It will be with you. You will be fine, but if you refuse to worship, then you'll be thrown into the midst of the fiery furnace in the same hour. And what God is it that will deliver you out of my hands? You can see the force that was being used, and this is the same force that was used, back in. This is just one example of that. But notice, notice the response of these men, and they were all in unity. You can tell they were in unity. And they said there, it says, in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men answered and said, there is no reason, there's no need for us to answer you cautiously in this matter. They didn't even give it a second thought. They weren't thinking, oh man, fire, God worship. Boy, this is a tough one. They didn't think that. Look. There is no need for us to answer you cautiously in this matter. And listen to the words. For if we are thrown into the burning fiery furnace, our Father whom we serve is able to save us. And that's absolutely true. Yahweh can step in and intervene at any time in any test or any trial that we're going through. But he says, there's no need for us to answer you cautiously. For if we are thrown into this fiery furnace, our Father whom we serve is able to deliver us, and may he deliver us from your hands, O king. So it was a request. It was, may he deliver us. But, notice the mindset, but if he will not, may it also be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. See, they had it set up in their minds, and they knew Yahweh could intervene. And their prayer was, and may he deliver us from your hands. But if he doesn't, if it's not his will, if it's his will that we suffer these things, know this, that we are going to stand, and we are going to stand, and we are going to serve Yahweh. We are not going to bow down and serve the gods. And of course, the rest of what took place in this instance here. Yahweh did intervene, and Yahweh did see fit to save these men from that particular test. And we need to keep that in mind. Yahweh's not going to put anything before us that we can't bear or that we can't deal with. We just need to have the trust and confidence in Yahweh that he will do, that he knows what's best for us, and we're going to experience what we need to for our benefit, for our growth, so that we can be beneficial members in his house, useful tools in his house.